Hey guys, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture, we're going to conclude our lecture, our examination, our look at the New Deal. And to begin with, I just like to dive right into our lecture topic. And then the first thing we're going to talk about is the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, or the AAA, which directly confronted the old problem of overproduction. Now, the AAA encouraged farmers to not put all of their land under cultivation to create scarcities. Now, the administration paid farmers not to plant crops, which inaugurated the current government program of offering subsidies to farmers not to put all their land under cultivation and not flood the market with produce, with their agricultural products. There was then and still now exists a great controversy over the idea of paying farmers not to farm. Some advocates see it as you're paying somebody not to do their job. Some advocates, some opponents of it see it as paying farmers to not put all the land under cultivation, paying farmers to be logical. If the farmers put all the land under cultivation, if they reap these huge crops, they're going to overproduce. They're going to drive down the market value. Many people said that the farmers shouldn't be paid to not put all their land under cultivation. That it was simply redundant. That simply telling the farmers that by putting their land under cultivation they were ruining themselves was sufficient enough. Many people still view it as a waste of federal funds to subsidize farming. Nonetheless, the entire scheme still continues on. And now the entirety of rural life was in an emergency crisis. It was very, very, very tense for people living on the farm. The Emergency Farm Mortgage Act was passed, and it provided federal funds to farmers who were unable to repay their mortgages and thus faced foreclosures. The Homeowners Loan Act did the same thing for urban dwellers, providing direct assistance when they were in jeopardy of losing their homes. As we previously discussed, the Hoover presidency was marked by bank failures and runs on banks. And just as Roosevelt was becoming president, there was a massive run on the banks. Now, to prevent future bank collapses, the Glass-Steagall Banking Act was passed. And it was another piece of legislation that was designed to restore confidence in the economy and the business community in general. The act established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the FDIC. Now, the FDIC guaranteed the banking deposits of an ordinary citizen up to $5,000. It's $5,000 when the act was first passed. One of the New Deal's most audacious projects, however, involved the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, and an economic scheme that Hoover had consistently refused to support. It was brought to Hoover, and Hoover consistently vetoed it. He continuously talked it down. This was that economic scheme in Tennessee that we spoke about on our lecture on Hoover and the Depression and the crash. Hoover refused to support it, but the Appalachian Mountains had been one of the more economic underdeveloped areas of the Republic, and it had been that way from the 18th century, from the beginnings of the Republic, from the Revolution, all the way into the 1930s. It had been one of the most economically underdeveloped areas. The area had been overlooked by slavercrafts and was sparsely settled. The area is very hilly, very rocky, not very conducive to the intensive agriculture that the slavercrafts wanted, or really desired, really looked for, as far as putting their slaves to the best possible use. In the 1930s, technology and agriculture and our architecture, I should say, had progressed to the point that hydroelectricity generation was a feasible undertaking in the Tennessee Valley. And the Tennessee Valley was a prime location. It is fed by many tributaries, and it was the perfect spot to build a dam to generate hydroelectrical power. The TVA became a lasting and powerful part of the federal government, as it still survives today and still serves to check private companies' prices and employs thousands of people in the Appalachian Mountains. Now, another major move of Roosevelt's was to suspend prohibition and later to champion a constitutional amendment confirming the Republic's abandonment of that social experiment. Now, though the nation overall rejoiced at prohibition, a number of counties in the southeastern United States passed county ordinances continuing prohibition ordinances that are really still in effect today. A lot of the good whiskey producing regions of Kentucky and so forth are still dry counties. A lot of county areas in Ohio and some in Indiana, they're still dry counties. We still have this phenomenon of dry counties. And even in some places where prohibition was removed altogether, there are still times of days and still certain days in which you won't be able to buy alcohol. I ran into a phenomenon which I personally oversaw somebody attempt to purchase alcohol on a Sunday in one city, and the person told them that nope, we don't sell it on today. They made a religious reference with Sunday being the Lord's Day, and that they're not going to in any way support someone debauching themselves through alcohol consumption on the Lord's Day. So there's still some areas with partial prohibition and some areas with still complete prohibition. But in any effect, prohibition nationally was done away with early on in 1933. Now, Roosevelt, has noted earlier, Roosevelt was a better charmer than Hoover. Hoover was not very good at warming people up to his positions, to his ideas. Roosevelt did not have that problem. Roosevelt was very successful at reaching the public and getting them to sign on with his policies. And he was widely respected because of his ingenious use of the radio. Again, we come back to the radio. We've seen the radio before become a vehicle for Father Charles Coughlin. We've seen the radio become a vehicle for baseball to rebrand itself, had America's pastime after the Black Sox scandal. And now we're seeing the president use the radio to, at a moment's notice, get into contact with his support base and to drum up support for his own political agenda. Now, the radio was still a relatively new technology, and Roosevelt expertly exploited it to maintain his popularity. He began to make weekly fireside chats to address the nation, with the intended purpose being that the president will be able to reach the Americans in their home had they sat by the radio. This was a revolutionary idea in and of itself. Until the radio, the vast majority of Americans never really saw or heard the president unless they were able to see the president in person. With the radio, the president was able to reach voters and maintain a national presence daily. Roosevelt gained an appreciation for the radio and used it to drum up support, as I stated earlier, for his programs by directing listeners to appeal to their representatives to support the president. If Roosevelt suspected that somebody was going to balk at supporting his measure, he would simply mention the measure, speak on its merits, and use his personal charisma, his wit, his charm, and his appeal to get his listeners, to get his audience to get them in a favorable disposition to his idea, and to have them force themselves on their representative to support Roosevelt and his agenda. And this really changed the tone of American politics. The great bombastic rhetoric of men like William Jennings Bryan, who were known for these very elaborate and really just sort of elaborate public speaking speeches, were really out of place. They really were out of place when confronted with the intimate and sedate medium of the radio and later on television. Something that I'll mention now, but we'll cover later on, will be the Nixon-Kennedy debate. That debate was both televised and broadcast on radio, and depending on which medium you got the information from, if you listened to it on the radio, if you saw it on television, you have different. You have a sort of different opinion on who won that debate and who really came out on top on that debate. So from there, we move to the Social Security Act. And the social changes continued in 1935 with the Social Security Act. And really, that act transformed old age in the United States. Prior to 1935, old age was a period of uncertainty. You were really unlikely to be employable again, and you were most likely going to subsist off of whatever aid, whatever benefit you can reap from being a member of your family. You were really at that point at the mercy of your families. The Social Security Act provided an old age pension to the elderly and made old age much more secure. The Social Security Act also included provisions for unemployment insurance to be paid for by both the worker and the employer. Now, the National Labor Relations Act strengthened labor unions, and in the 1930s, the ethnic voting bloc that made up the union base of the Democratic Party was comprised of union members. Roosevelt saw that it was in his interest to support them. He cajoled employers into negotiating with unions and including better deals, better hours for union members. And I mean, the most remarkable of this stance was the steel industry, which had a long-standing and bitter opposition to unions. That opposition eroded, and the steel union membership swelled. They made great strides in the steel union, and emboldened by their new numbers, the political backing, union membership spread in other industries as well. As a matter of fact, union members held their first ever sit-down strike in 1937 at a General Motors automobile manufacturing plant. The sit-down strike was revolutionary because it offset the workers' fears of being replaced by strike breakers, because the owners were fearful of damaging their own industrial equipment, so they didn't do anything. They didn't bring in strike breakers. They didn't bring in any sort of like private agents to beat the workers or anything like that. And the strikers themselves were very careful to preserve a good public image. They took pledges to swear off alcohol and to not damage any equipment, while their families outside the plant set up kitchens to pass water and food inside. Roosevelt himself intervened on behalf of the strikers after 44 days. And as stated earlier, Roosevelt and the New Deal were not universally acclaimed. In the preceding administrations, a number of conservative justices had been named to the court, and in 1935 they struck out at Roosevelt and named a number of his New Deal programs unconstitutional. In particular, the NRA and the AAA were both struck down by the Supreme Court. And in 1936, Roosevelt was facing a daunting re-election, having to overcome a number of challengers and critics of his New Deal. One of Roosevelt's detractors was Father Charles Coughlin, a Detroit area priest who had a weekly radio broadcast, and he used his voice to spread his own social program rooted in Roman Catholic teaching. Now, Father Coughlin was an early supporter of the New Deal, but he soon soured of Roosevelt and became convinced that Roosevelt was in league with Jewish bankers. And indeed, Coughlin himself would be disgraced by his thinking by his thoughts of a Jewish banking conspiracy. Huey Long. Huey Long, the popular former governor of Louisiana and then sitting senator from Louisiana, was another vocal critic of Roosevelt. Long was the reigning political boss of the entire state of Louisiana, and he really radically reformed Louisiana state politics, though he kept the endemic corruption going as long as it served his purposes. Long had a political plan known as the Share Our Wealth Plan. And that plan called for a guaranteed yearly income of $5,000 for every family, among other financial promises. Now, there remains skepticism relating to the feasibility of Long's plan. Long, unfortunately, was assassinated by a former supporter, and so we will never know how he intended to support his share the wealth plan. We don't know what he would have done. Now, another plan to provide aid to the suffering came from Francis Townsend. Now, Townsend was a California doctor who had been spurred to action by the sight of two elderly women digging about a trash can for food. His plan, known as the Townsend Plan, called for everyone over the age of 60 to retire so that a younger person could find employment. The retirees would then be given $200 $200 in a monthly stipend that they had to spend immediately within the month. They could not be given the money and hold on to it. They had to immediately get the money and put it back into the economy, put that money into circulation. Now, in 1936, it was an election year, and the Republican candidate was Alf Landon of Kansas. The election of 1836 was one of the most lopsided victories in all of United States history. Roosevelt won every state except Maine and New Hampshire, winning an unprecedented 523 electoral votes. Wealthy Republicans and those who held true to Hoover's approach to the Depression deeply disliked Roosevelt. They often hailed Roosevelt as a class traitor for his policies, including the 1935 tax known as the Soak the Rich tax, which raised taxes for the wealthy. After its election victory, Roosevelt attempted to pack the Supreme Court with his own supporters. After observing that the courts at will could nullify his legislation, leaving him hopeless to do anything about it. Now, the Constitution prescribes for the establishment of a Supreme Court, but our Constitution does not state how many members the court shall have. And throughout the early years of the court, really for the first 3/4 of the court's existence, there wasn't a fixed number for justices. They sort of just made justices whenever they felt. They sort of just appointed a number of justices to the court. It wasn't fixed at the current 9. Now, by Roosevelt presidency, the number was firmly fixed at 9. It was firmly set at 9. Now, Roosevelt's plan for court packing was fairly simple. He wanted to add Democratic nominees to the court who could defend his legislation. He also wanted to push the elderly justices to retire. His plan called for a new associate justice to be named to the court whenever a justice turned 70. And this would continue for a maximum court membership of 15 justices. Now, Roosevelt encountered stiff resistance from among the general population, his own party, and of course the Republican Party, for this blatant and flagrant attempt to undermine the Supreme Court. The court composition was ultimately saved by Associate Justice Owen Roberts, who began to vote in favor of the New Deal legislation. And Roberts did that, many suspect, and many hold the opinion that Roberts did that to save the court, to save the integrity, to save the reputation of the court. He sacrificed his own personal beliefs to save the institution that he loved. And things fell in line for Roosevelt. Had he had the opportunity to name a justice of his own in 1937 when he named sitting Senator Hugo Black to the Supreme Court. Now, Black was a scandalous choice because he lacked really any judicial experience. And the New Deal, while it was widely accepted and supported, really did little to nothing to alleviate the Depression or to restore confidence. Unemployment remained high, and the United States began to recover when the Republic only began to recover when the public began to rearm in preparation for World War II. And with that, we'll end here. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. I'm Ted, and I'll see you guys next time.